It's February 25th, 1999, and we are in Titusville, Florida, with Guenter Wendt, and we're going to ask him some questions about his career with the space program. Let's start with something real basic and really a long time ago. And I'm curious, when you were growing up in Germany as a kid, did you ever imagine what was ahead for you?
No, not in that line, but ever since I was in grade school, I started with building model airplanes. So then after that, I graduated to flying sailplanes. And I always was interested in flying machines, so to speak. So I actually signed up to learn to manufacture aircraft. And I started with Henschel at that time. At the same time, I went to evening classes to make a degree in mechanical engineering. So didn't have much of fun youth, but nevertheless, then after all that was pretty much done, we had something that they called World War II. And with my background, I had an offer from the Air Force to go in as a second lieutenant if I would sign up for 12 years. Which was detrimental to my outlook on life. I didn't want to sign up for the military for 12 years, so I said, no, I don't do that. So they said, okay, then we just come and get you and you become a buck private. So it didn't take long and they sent you the typical postcard greetings. You know, we like to meet you. So nevertheless, so I then, after basic training and so on, I wound up in a night fighter group, flying Ingress 88s as flight engineer. And then when we ran out of gas, the end of the war, I wound up as a parachute, in the parachute division, the 5th Parachute Division. And after the war, it turned out there was no need for anybody who knew anything about airplanes because there was no industry whatsoever. So after that, since my parents were divorced, I mean my father had deserted the family, but he was an American. So I thought, oh, let me use the last known address and see if maybe I can make it over to America. And sure enough, he hadn't moved. So we got in contact and eventually he sponsored me to get over there. And in '49, I arrived in the United States. So by that time, he had also talked to the Mr. Mac, J.S. McDonnell, and told him that he had a son who did this and this. And Mr. Mac said, oh, yeah, we'd gladly like to have him. So I interviewed with McDonnell, but then found out that since Germany was still legally at war, even in '45 and '49 with the United States, that they couldn't hire me. So I had to take all kinds of jobs until I finally wound up with working for an airline, started up as a startup airline like Ozark Airlines in St. Louis. We had 5 beaten up old DC-3s, which was rather a good experience to learn aircrafts again. And after 5 years I was a citizen, and then I immediately changed over to McDonnell at that time and started off in the design department and had various jobs there. And rather intriguing things that happened then, you know, when you have these things with confidential and secret things. I designed a lifting mechanism at that time to carry in the B-52s the decoy missiles, what we called the GAM-72. They were little airplane type things that would fly formation around the B-52 bomber to attract enemy aircraft or missiles. And we had a final review by the Air Force, and I was supposed to make the presentation of the system, how we were loading them. And found out they wouldn't even let me in the room because it was then classified secret and only had confidential clearance. So even I designed the system, I couldn't present it. So then after a while I heard the rumor that McDonnell was trying to bid on a civilian program called Mercury. So I looked into it and it sounded interesting, all kinds of fantastic things, but nobody had ever done anything like that. So I talked to the project engineer and I says, you know, you actually need somebody who can do both things, engineering-wise and all the hands-on. Since I now had the thing, I had made a practical apprenticeship in aircraft manufacturing. I knew how things were put together, and I had a mechanical engineering degree. And they said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So I wound up on Project Mercury. So then we built the stuff, and by But before we ever got done with that one, we had another program where McDonnell had contracted with the Air Force to design, develop, and proof test a boost glide vehicle, which was called a Alpha Draco. And so again, I thought to get experience in rocket launches, I transferred over to these people, and I became responsible for the launcher of that boost glide vehicle, which was actually a solid two-stage rocket that we had modified an Honest John launcher and launched it here from the Cape. Now, if you want to compare prices these days, now this is in 58, 59, McDonnell had agreed to design, build, test fly, and deliver the data to the Air Force for 3 complete missiles for $5 million. And we did that for $5 million. Now compare that to today's prices. Anyhow, so this was the first exposure to Cape Canaveral at that time. On one of the flights we had here, they permitted us to take the families down, and I took my family down here, and we stayed on an old sea spray motel on the beach in Cocoa Beach, 30 days. And my children I had 2 girls at the time, they were with me. They really liked the beach, the wife liked the beach, and I said, now, if I ever get a permanent job down here, would you like it down here? Now, coming from St. Louis, you know, the beach and seeing orange trees and things like that was fascinating. So they said that would be a good idea. So then when Mercury came along, I managed to get down here as one of the first representatives for McDonnell. We were 5 people, and we opened this shop down here.
Did you know what, I mean, at the time, did you know that you were basically talking your way on to what was really probably the most exciting place to work at the time? I mean, did you know that, or was it?
No, actually, it was always my idea. I wasn't made to do repetitive jobs. I always said, look what you like to do, then find out what it takes to get the job, and then convince the powers to be that you are the man they need to do. So I always started out to say, okay, what do I need to do? And then I said, okay, here's what you need, and here's what I have. I always would go after the job I like to do, and anything new, fascinating, was it. But then all through the years, although I took 42 extension courses in order to stay on top of it, because then after Mercury, John Yardley was my boss at that time, and I said, I tell you what, I'll go with Germany. He says, what the heck do I need you in Germany for? And I said, look, you need this, this, this. I have all these things. You know, we are talking about now hypergonics, cryogenics, and things like that. So I had taken extension courses, and so again, he said, yes, that sounds great. And by that time, I had somewhat established a way of operations that, as a matter of fact, Glenn labeled me a pad Führer. As a matter of fact, in one of the pictures, you see it. He said I reminded him of somebody that he knew in history who was somewhat on the dictatorial side. And I indicated, I said, no, it's not really that bad. Just, you see us on that picture, just do what I tell you, and you have no problem. So that's when actually it wound up that I later was labeled the dictator on the pad, which wasn't really true. But then again, you had to realize you're playing with things which can go wrong in a hurry. And I spent many, many nights on the river in my boat playing the what-if game, because there were many, many things we didn't know. And we did dumb things. We did things we didn't know. I remember one thing in Mercury, way back when we had an explosion at the Cape at a spin test facility, where a solid rocket ignited because of the plastic static electricity that was, and I found out our escape rocket in Mercury was wrapped in the same plastic that blew up in a spin test. So here again, you learn things that you didn't know existed. So then you think, okay, now if we go out later on when the vehicles are flight pressurized or things like that, your chances of survival are relatively slim. So, and in the early days, when you talk about the late 50s, early 60s, the average rockets here, 3 out of 5 didn't make it. So failure rate was rather high. So when we got to be, it wasn't that tragic when you just had a nose cone on it. But then when you all of a sudden said, okay, now we have a human being up there, somebody you know, then the picture changes drastically. So you sit down and you play the what if game. What if you see this? What can you do if you see that? And so on. So I spent many ungodly hours. Like I said, the best place to be was sitting in the boat in the river and just playing the what if game.
Well, when you first came down here, in what year was that? When you first
59.
In 1950.
In 58. That's when I came with the Alpha Draco in 58. Yeah.
And you were with McDonnell.
Yes. I stayed with McDonnell.
It wasn't even McDonnell Douglas at the time. It was McDonnell Aircraft Corporation.
Right. And
what was your first job for them here?
Now that was again, I was the, okay, we had an interesting thing. I was supposed to be responsible for the pad operations for the spacecraft. Now you're going to realize all through my active career I had very little to do with the boosters or the rockets itself. In other words, I knew the basic fundamentals of it, but I had no input as to what they did, how they did, or when they did. So essentially I was responsible for the spacecraft preparations for launch. In other words, once the spacecraft hit the Cape, then we had to coordinate who wants to do what or who must do what from the time it got here until we launched it.
And
that
this was
my
Mercury.
job. That was Mercury. And same later on with Germany. And that was my job to go ahead and coordinate all these efforts. So in the beginning then I worked with I interfaced with the Huntsville people, with Werner von Braun and Dr. Greene, Dr. Diebes and Küttner, and so on, to correlate, because you know, we were still doing something that hasn't been done before. So that was essentially my job, to shepherd the spacecraft through that. And that was going all the way through launch. Now once the thing lifted off, that was the end of my responsibility. Then I didn't have anything to do with it. And the chain of command actually is that I reported strictly to the test conductor. Now it was a little interesting in that somewhere in this operation I would change allegiance. With other words, in the preliminary stages, and even especially later on Apollo, each section has their own test conductor, like McDonnell or North American had the capsule, and then the S2 had a test conductor, the first stage had a test conductor. And then at some point they merge to the CBTS, or the NASA test director. And see, then I would report to the NASA test director. And the unique position was that even through all this time, I did have the ability to stop the count if I saw something wrong, but I couldn't make it go again, because then somebody else had to make that decision. So that was the basic concept that we had, because early in the game one time Annie, John Glenn's wife, asked me, that says, can you guarantee me a safe return of John? And you know, astronauts used to be over to our houses and things like that. And I told Annie, I said, Annie, anybody who would guarantee that is a liar, because there are so many unknowns that nobody can really guarantee you a safe return. I said, the only guarantee I can give you is that at the time when I say it is go, there is nothing that I know that could be detrimental to a safe return. Beyond that, I cannot give you any other guarantee, because what happens after that, we do not know. But there was another little interesting sideline, if you want to have little stories. While we were working on Mercury, John was a Presbyterian, and I had built the Presbyterian church on the beach there in Cocoa Beach. And at that time they had about 30 young people staying for 2 weeks at the church, you know, going to the beach and using the church as the kitchen and to sleep there. They asked if I could give them an update, you know, on space. And I said, yeah, I do that. I asked John, I said, hey, John, Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, you got a free time, hour or so, we go there. He agreed. So at that time he wasn't that well known. So he called me, he said, I'm going to be a little late. And I said, okay. So I started the meeting off. I said, I got a friend, John. He comes from the Langley Center, an engineer, and let it go as such. Then when John came up, I said, here's my friend John. And then I got a little devious about it, and we were talking about space, and I explained to them that if we re-enter in the wrong way, we would skip off the Earth's atmosphere and we never see the astronaut again. And I said, now, if that happens, should we cancel the space program? And one young fellow said, he looked at us, he says, no, why wouldn't you do that? Take another one, you got 7 of them, don't you? So I looked at John, I said, I wonder how one of the 7 would really feel about it. I said, let me ask John, because he happens to be one of the 7, you know, and it became hilarious. By the way, we were supposed to go and be there between 7 and 8:30 and so on. We got out there close to midnight. But
how did he say he felt about that? What did he tell them he felt about that?
No, he said that this is a chance that you take, but you try to avoid taking it. With other words, I mean, you know, and you try to get away all the things that could lead you in that predicament. And by the way, the boy said when he found out John was one of the, oh, where's a hole I can climb into? But this is, again, you know, John was very, very much people-oriented. I mean, he was great. As a matter of fact, he had a patience that I wouldn't have had. We were at dinner with his family and Scott Carpenter and so on at the Holiday Inn at that time. And the fellow came up, during the dinner, shoved the picture in his nose, and says, hey, sign this, you know. And I was going to tell the fellow what he could do with the picture. But John says, okay, he signed it. I said, John, I think I could have told him what he can do with the picture. He says, good. He says, that goes with the job. So he was always that way, that oriented. And it was interesting to work with him. He went sometimes afoul with the other astronauts who thought that time was precious and you have to use every minute of it for whatever comes along. But not John.
Well, as pad leader, in charge of pad operations, I'm curious because this is a job that no one had done before. It didn't exist before, to be responsible for launching humans into space. So how did you kind of create your own job description? Okay, now it was really interesting. To begin with, when we were sitting at McDonnell and so on, we said, okay, now officially what do we call that position? Now it started off as pad manager. No, manager didn't fit into the McDonnell organization. Okay, then let's call it a pad director. No, NASA said, it wasn't NASA at that time. I mean, they said, okay, we can't have a director because that doesn't fit in our organization. So we had to come up, we kicked all kinds of names around. So finally, I think I came up, I said, okay, why don't we just call it the lead personnel? So we call it the pad leader. So that's how the name was created, because it was a unique position. If you understand, here is a civilian employee. I worked for McDonnell. I had people working for me. I had a NASA inspector. I had Air Force technicians as suit technicians. I had a NASA astronaut as a backup man, you know, and sometimes I had a NASA technician or somebody else. So I had really different categories, but I still was in charge of the whole thing. So that was a unique position that we created. And for that purpose, it worked out great, because at the same time, later on, I was always accused that I worked for NASA, because, and Rockwell only paid me, but see, you can't look at a badge. If you have a job to do, you have to go with what the job requires, not what some organizational element will put on paper as being it. Essentially, I knew one boss, and that was the test conductor, okay? If anything went wrong, you know, test conductor would need to know it, and he would make the decision. I could tell him what it is, I would tell him what my recommendations were, but the final decision was with the test conductor. And at some time it was a McDonnell guy in the early stages of tests, you know. Then later on, when we got to integrated test, then it became the NASA guy. You have to realize, and it was actually later on the fine psychiatrist told us, that you have to be able to laugh at yourself every once in a while, or you go off on the deep end. Because 10, 12, 14-hour work days were the normal early stages of the game. Like at one time I went 7 weeks without a day off. So you had to be able to laugh at yourself or make a joke, and at other times there was no room for that.
So you had to have a good dividing line.
What were some of your favorite jokes from the Mercury? Let's kind of go through program by program, and I'm going to ask you a few things about the program itself, but let's start on the lighter side of Mercury. What were some of your favorite funny things that you all did to kind of lighten the serious mood of what you were doing?
You tried all kinds of different things, in early stages. Oh, as a matter of fact, one of my very favorite one, which I liked very much, is because as a sideline where I was located on the launch pad and so on, I always was elected to escort VIPs and other people around. And you run into all kinds of people, and some of my not so favorite people used to be politicians. So here we were in the early stages, and we were launching Ham and Ingress. And I wound up as, we were at Hangar S at that time, where the Air Force was controlling the chimps. And here comes what I thought a little bit obnoxious congressman, and he said, I want to see the apes. I said, okay, they are not really apes, but we'll see if we can get there. So I got down there and I talked to the handlers, the Air Force captain, I forgot his name, and he said, oh, Enos just came back from a training session and he is pretty much ticked off, and Ham just went into it, so I'm not sure. And he says, you know what Enos does? I said, yeah, I know what he does, but I got somebody who wants to see him. So he says, I would rather not. I said, okay. So I go out, I says, Congressman, I said, we only got one chimp right now that came out of training, and his disposition isn't that great. I'd rather have not that you go in. He says, oh, you're telling me I can't see the apes. I said, no, sir, I'm not telling you can't see the apes, but sometimes it might be better not to do that. He says, I'm a congressman. If I want to do that, I like to do that. I said, okay, go ahead, sir. So he went in, and I kind of had an indication what was going to happen. So he went ahead of us, and knowing Enos, he was on the left-hand side in the cage, he saw us coming, and he thought he was going to be put back in training, which he didn't like. So he hunched down and deposited something in his hand, and he hit that guy from 15 feet square on the chest, and was dripping down on his nice white shirt and tie. And he looked at it, he says, oh, I guess I know now why you didn't want me to go in. I said, so I didn't know that was going to happen, but these are unpredictable animals. So these are the lighter moments, when you can sometimes get to these people.
So you were secretly laughing about that?
Oh, most certainly. I mean, I thought it was going to come, and I thought, there's one of those guys that won't take no for an answer, so we'll let him have it.
Now, what about some of the jokes that you and the Mercury astronauts would play on each other?
They were always saying, like, Shepard was a great guy. Like, he disliked public relations people. So once there was a big photo session or a camera session set up in the crew quarters. And so what he had done is, at that time, there were old buildings, they had these old screw-type fuses in the electrical circuits. So he got cardboard washers and put them all on the screw-type fuses. Needless to say, when all the people came up to do their camera interviews and so on, none of the electrical circuits worked. That he did that. And then you heard the famous story with Dee O'Hara, who was our nurse there, having a problem with Wally, getting samples from Wally, and she complained to Deke. So he heard about it. So what Wally did is, we got a big 5-gallon water jug, filled it with tea, put a little detergent in it, made it foam, and then set it on Dee O'Hara's desk as Wally's sample, in the morning. So we always had little things that we would do for each other, and Shepard was great for that too. I mean, one time we were on the pad, and he was there, and Gus was there, and Walt Williams was the chief engineer for NASA at that time, and he got a call, you need to go to Cocoa Beach for a press conference, but he didn't have a car. So he said, oh man, I need to get to Cocoa Beach. So Shepard says, oh, heck, take my Corvette. The astronauts at the time all had gray Corvettes. And he had one, and Grissom had one. He said, I ride with Grissom, And Walt says, oh, you don't mind? No. So sure enough, he gave him the keys, and then Walt chopped off. And the next thing is I noticed is, here goes Shepard to the window and watched Walt take off, picks up the phone, calls security. He said, some SOB just took my gray Corvette, he's heading for the south gate. Walt Williams showed up at the South Gate, and there were 4 guards. They didn't even ask the question. They lifted him out of the Corvette, slammed him against the wall, and they didn't talk to each other for 4 weeks. So these were some of the neatest things you did. You know, you had to make do with lots of things that sometimes were funny. Some other times, like I mentioned, the long hours. McDonnell was very good for us. I mean, in the management people, we could do lots of things, like I could buy things with petty cash if I needed it. And so one evening we were still testing, and we had about another hour to go, and the troops got restless in the blockhouse. You know, they hadn't eaten or anything like that since lunch. But if I powered down, we would lose at least 6 or 8 hours time, because you power down, the guy I chop off, it takes him 2 hours to get back, you power up, another 2 hours. So I asked them if they could make do with ham and cheese sandwiches and coffee. They said, yeah, do that. So I called Ramones and I ordered 100 ham and cheese sandwiches and 2 urns of coffee to be delivered to the South Gate. Then I asked my tech supervisor there, I said, hey, can you send somebody to the South Gate, pick up the stuff? So we were doing that, and within 1 hour we were finished. And I paid out of petty cash for the ham and cheese and things like that. Later on, I mean Apollo, later on, I couldn't do that anymore because they wouldn't allow you to expend petty cash like that. I could, for instance, it was neat. If I needed a guy and he was in a carpool, I could offer him a taxi, you know, and say I pay you 4 hours overtime because, you know, you need key people. And we did lots of things that were not maybe in the rule books, but you expedited what you needed to do. The same way you would call Boeing or you would call Martin and says, hey, I need 20 AN4 fittings. Do you have any on hand? God said, yeah, I got a whole box full. Come and get them. And he said, oh, by the way, you got half a sheet of stainless steel? Yeah, we got some. So I said, hey, have some stainless, you know, or if I didn't have anything, you still would give me the fittings. And we didn't have any paperwork or anything like that. See, at that time, and that's what deteriorated later, especially now today, your word was good as gold. In other words, you promised something, you delivered. You didn't need 15 pieces of paper or 20 signatures. And that was really the success of the early program. Everyone, you didn't care what kind of a badge you had. Somebody needed something, you had it, you gave it to him.
Well, one of the things that George Page said to me was, you know, Guenter had a reputation as being such a tough guy. He said, but my feeling always was that if I was the test director and Guenter was in charge at the pad, I rest assured knowing everything was going to be done right. And that if he told me things were go, he meant it. Which I guess plays on what you were just talking about. I mean, that sense of that fine line between Guenter the dictator and your word counts for something.
You can, I mean, in this situation, you cannot lie to people. You cannot give them a bunch of baloney. But in other words, you say, hey, I know or I do not know. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I do not know. You say, I need to find out. But they knew if I said, yes, you are ready to go. They knew it was ready to go. But at the same time, if somebody was going to fake it, you wouldn't tolerate it. In other words, at one time I had another contractor who, in front of a whole bunch of people, told me that the contractor, he was a government employee, and he said, all you guys are out is to screw the government. And I said, now if that was a joke, it was a very bad one. And if that's your attitude, I said, I don't need you on the pad, I have you replaced. He said, you can't replace me, I'm a government employee. A little did he know, I also had a reputation of knowing quite a few people who knew me. Within 15 minutes he had left the pad and never came back. In other words, you know, you have to maintain your reputation, you cannot jeopardize it. And whatever it takes, you have to deliver. So in other words, I was very, very conscientious of that. And so were the people. If I went to the test supervisor, to the tech supervisor, I says, Jim, can you do that in 2 hours? He said, man, give me 2.5. I said, okay, 2.5 you make it. He said, I make it. He got it. In 2.5 hours he may have killed himself, you know, but it was there. And see, this is where you base your confidence on. With other words, like when I talk to the test conductor, he isn't there, he doesn't see what goes on. I am his eyes. And if I give him a phony story, the system won't work. So with other words, he has to rely on it, that whatever it is true. With other words, before a test, hours before that, I would go up, I would look through all the books and so on. Did we all complete this? If a guy says, oh, that is done. I said, if it is done, why do I not see a stamp there? With other words, you know, you can't go halfway. It either is or is not. And sometimes it gets into hair of some people. As a matter of fact, at one time, also on Mercury, we had a problem, and we were very short on time, and the electrical engineering manager, Bruce, he was going to go ahead and take 2 wires and test into a plug. And I wouldn't let him do that, because the same plug, about the 54 connector plug, had the squibs in which fired the Draco shoots and so on. So I told him, I said, the only way I'll let you do that is by making me a companion plug with pigtails. We check it out. If it checks out, he said, that takes 4 hours. I said, the longer you talk, the longer it takes. And so he went to John Yardley, and Yardley called me and he says, what's the story on that? I said, John, over my dead body, he says, I wouldn't let him do it. And John called back, he says, who in the hell works for whom? I said, John, you know who works for whom, but the longer you talk. And then he says, okay, we'll make a pigtail, you know. So later on, John came up, he says, you know, I could have saved me a lot of time. I shouldn't have even called you. I knew what was the outcome going to be. But see, there are certain things you let happen and certain things you cannot let happen. You have to have a line where you say, okay, that's it. And that was also the reason. See, after the Gemini program, most of the astronauts, they said, okay, we'd like you to come over to Apollo. Now see, Apollo was built by North American at that time. McDonnell didn't have Apollo because we had finished Gemini. So I talked to the managers at North America, and I said, okay, now I need to understand I have complete control over the people that work for me. I have the hiring and firing authority, and I report to the base manager. No, we can't do that with a new hire, you know. I said, okay. Since that's the only way I knew how to do my job, and it has worked well for 2 programs, I cannot see making any change. So I said, you don't need me. So then I stayed with McDonnell and came to Titusville, and actually I opened the gun range for testing anti-tank missiles here in Titusville. They called them more at that time. That was until after the fire. Now the fire took me very hard because when you know the individuals, you know you have horsed around with them and they're your friends. And so then a couple of days later I got a call from Slayton, and he said, hey, you know, we really need some help, so come on over and work with North American. I said, hey, Dick, won't work because I can't do my job the way I'm used to. He said, oh, I got somebody says you can. I just put him on. The guy got on the phone. He said, I'm Mr. Bergen, and I can assure you can have whatever you need. I didn't know who the heck Bergen was. So I talked then to Pierce and more, and we agreed, yeah, that's, I need to revamp the system there. Because, okay, let's not go into detail what was wrong. And so then I said, oh, by the way, who the heck is Bergen? You know, the guy I talked to a couple of nights ago, and they had one of those picture organization charts, and there on top was one that says, Bergen, President of North America. So then I knew why I could get now what I needed. So then I started over on the Apollo program. And I made some changes because you know, when you have something that works well for you, why would you want to change it?
You said the fire upset you. Did you have that sense of that you wish you'd gone, that you wish you'd already been there, or do you think you could have even made any difference?
You know, that's a question that I was rather frequently asked. You know, would you have it prevented it? And I always refused to answer that question because I would be strictly projector. Yeah, okay. So. Later on, I thought, in a way, it was unique, you know, somebody's looking out for me, because if I had been there and it happened to me, it would have been very, very devastating, okay? So I was spared that, having been in charge of it. See, that later on happens again with the Challenger. I mean, I was not involved directly, even though I was in the safety world at that time for Rockwell, and I was primarily responsible for flight crew safety. There was nothing wrong with the orbiter. See, so that was again, it did not fall in my area of responsibility, because that's when it really gets to you. If you have no control over, there's not much you can do, and it's a little easier to take. Let's put it that way. So somebody's looking out for me.
Let's go back to Mercury for a minute. Give me a sense of what your crew's responsibilities were. I mean, you know, let's say maybe on launch day, and let's take each program that you worked on. You know, what did you all do on launch day, and what were your responsibilities?
Mercury wasn't as complicated, so to speak, as later on Gemini and Apollo. Now, what you have to do before you launch it, first thing, once you go through the steps a little bit, you put your spacecraft on top of the rocket, okay? Now you have to hook up all the connectors that interface with the rocket itself. Then you have to prove that all the wiring and the umbilical, see, your headline now is an umbilical, that all these circuits in there work. Then each system engineer wants to make sure his system is still working, be it communication system, oxygen system, you know, environmental control system, the guidance system, and so on. So each one needs to test it. Now the problem is, each one wants to do it at the same time. That doesn't work. You now have to go ahead and play traffic cop and says, okay, you can do your job at that time slot after we are powered up, and you can do yours at that time, and you have to hold up with that. However, I need these people to monitor this. See, that's where it gets in. So you prepare everything. Then before launch, you get, now in Mercury it wasn't that critical, because they didn't have much in the line of food provisioning or things like that. But you had to load the oxygen on board. You know, you had to load the peroxide, hydrogen peroxide, which, by the way, was a big problem for John Glenn's flight, because we had to scrub a couple of times. And then you have to see that all the pressure systems work correctly, and that you can integrate it with the launch count, with the other activities that the launch vehicle has to do. Take, for instance, you do have to check the command destruct system, which destroys the rocket. But you want to make sure it doesn't do it while you're sitting on the pad. So you have simulators in it. Then after that, you have to hook the connectors up. Now you have to verify that the connectors are hooked up correctly. So there are lots and lots of things that you have to do in order to verify that everything works correctly. So that was what we had to do, and sometimes it takes hours and hours on end to do that. As a matter of fact, we always had a little joke, you know, in John's flight also, we had a periscope in the Mercury. And laying on your back for hours on end is not the most comfortable thing. So one time the doctors in the blockhouse, now the Aeromet facilities were always our enemies because they always came up with some requirements, and you know, they wanted to poke the astronaut one more time, need some more blood, need some more urine, and bring back all the samples, you know, that you discharge. So all of a sudden they said that John's heart rate and breathing rate had gone up, and they didn't have an explanation for that. And John said he was perfectly all right. You see, never did we tell the blockhouse that one of our techs had held the centerfold of Playboy magazine in front of the periscope. So that was one of the cute things. And the other one was...
I would thought John Glenn wouldn't react to that. He was such a, good...
I mean, but it was so unusual to see that, you know. Then the other time is we had a very famous German restaurant in Cocoa Beach, which served real good German food. So one day we were in the spacecraft and we were testing it, and Scott Carpenter was in. Now you need to understand the old suit system. I mean, to begin with, all the suits were set up to fly in space at 5 psi absolute pressure, you know, and 100% oxygen. So they had a circulating system in the suit where the air would recirculate, goes through a scrubber, you know, it takes the carbon monoxide out and so on. And so on. And here was Scott and was several hours in it, and the next thing you hear on the headset, oh, oops, something is wrong, you know. A minute later you go like, oh. And by that time I could see the doctors climbing up on their chairs, you know, Scott, what is wrong? One more time, and they after became unglued and wanted to stop the count. They said, Scott, tell us what is wrong. He said, okay, if you really want to know, he said, that's the last time I go to that German restaurant, have knockwurst, sauerkraut and beer. And I leave it to your imagination what happened in his suit. So, but see, with that, at every couple of minutes, the whole thing would come back to him, whatever was in the suit.
What fun.
There was, well, we had some lighter moments there, see. So.
Now, when you know, on closeout, you talked about all the things that you did to get ready for closeout. You know, one of the things was getting the astronaut into the Mercury capsule and knowing that you're the last person maybe that they're going to see. Tell me about that process and when you would leave the pad. You know, how long were they out there by themselves?
Okay.
I mean,
now essentially what happens is before the astronaut gets in, you have the suit technician go in and arrange all the cables, the straps, the restraint system, the hoses, so that nothing gets damaged, especially in Mercury when the astronaut gets in. Because it was a pretty tight fit, we always used to show, say we get the astronaut in with a shoehorn and we get him out with a can opener, because it was very, very tight places. So once we had everything arranged and the astronaut would get in, I asked the test conductor, are you ready for crew ingress? That's what we normally used to call it. He gave us a go that everything, in other words, he didn't know of nothing wrong with the booster, nothing wrong with the other people, nothing wrong with the range, nothing wrong with the ground support equipment. He would give us a go for insertion. So then we put the astronaut in. The suit tech would hook up all the hoses and the restraint systems, the comm system, and so on. So then the next thing is you do a comm check, see that the communications work. The environmental people look that the flow, the airflow is correct, and so on. If everything is great, nothing has changed, no big problem, then I ask permission to go ahead and close the hatch. Once I get a go to close the hatch, I normally would lean in and I say, now you need to understand communications are limited because he has a big bubble on. So I would normally go in and said, okay, are you happy with everything it is? You know, just give me the thumbs up. Or he would say, yes, yes, okay. If he said he's okay, one look around that we removed anything like safety pins later on in Germany and so on. Everything looks okay. Then I would tell the techs, okay, put the hatch on. So then we put the hatch on. The next thing we need to do is run a cabin pressure check, a leak check. If that turns out all right, then we are now ready to go. And normally about an hour before liftoff, we would clear out the white room, leave it, you know, and then we would leave. In other words, now the structure would go back, the last range support functions were performed, and then we had a liftoff.
Where would you watch the launch from?
We would go to a very forward position, what we call the roadblock, where the crew, I had always an emergency crew that in case we need to go in a hurry, we would stay there right at the roadblock. I also had my electrical technicians, mechanical technicians, and the system guys that were at the last minute still available. We had them there at the roadblock because everybody else would be cleared. So we would be watching it from the roadblock.
And right there. Now, during that time, I mean, you've talked about how you were a stickler for doing things right, but let's face it, the rules were very different. I mean, I've heard stories of, you know, you just walk through clouds of toxic fume. And
sure.
Give me a sense of that, of how different it was compared to today where, you know, you can't move without, you know, these regulations being followed and these safety. I mean, give me a sense of that and your feelings about the changes.
Now you got to understand, there were lots of things we did not know. You know, with other words, the flow system, for instance, on the Redstone rocket was you filled it until it ran out from the overflow on a pipe, which was just dumping it right on the pad. And later on we learned that oxygen and tar don't work together too well. You know, so, but we still did it that way, but except we took the tar out and put silicone in. So you learned a great deal, but we did also find out, we says, hey, anybody on the pad, don't smoke for the next 4 hours because the oxygen saturates your clothes and polyester clothes goes up in flames. So you learned as you went along, and a lot of safety precautions that you took. Like for instance, when we learned that in Huntsville, a very, very nice orderly technician had gotten some of the scripts. The scripts are initiators that electrically initiate a pyrotechnic charge, you know, to blow rocket. And he had some of the scripts in his hand, and he saw a big power cable laying on the ground there, which looked pretty messy. So he curled it up nicely, and when he had it up nicely, the scripts in his hand went off. Why? Because he had created an electromagnetic coil. It was 400 cycles at that time, and it blew up. So now we found out that you could blow up scripts rather easily with electromagnetic actions.
What happened to his hand?
It wasn't bad. I mean, it was just slightly burned. But now we learned that you have to have what we called 1 amp no fire scripts. So okay, you change the scripts. And see, as you go along, you learn a great deal about it. And it's an evolving process.
What do you think about how strict things are now?
Now, actually, things were stricter a little bit in the beginning. Now, you need to understand the Air Force was very strict with their rules and regulations. You don't vent anything on the Air Force side, even some of them were ridiculous. But again, you know how that goes sometimes. Then later on, when we learned a thing, we made our own rules, and especially with hypergolics. Now here again, there used to be the famous red clouds around the nitrogen tetroxide. Now we didn't think it was that bad, you know, it gave you a sour taste on your tongue and so on, but frequently on the Germany pad our white room was enclosed in a big old red cloud. Now it wasn't that bad until we found out if you parked a car close by, or if the security came up and they walked through the clouds, all their badges turned black and the bumpers turned black on the cars. So we found that might not be too good to breathe, that stuff. So, but we had to learn all these things. As a matter of fact, when you talk about something like, I remember Schiaffeletti, when we used the peroxide system, you always could tell the people that worked on the peroxide systems, because they always had white hair, on even being 20 years old. Because hydrogen peroxide does something like that. So it gets hairy. When I mentioned peroxide, for instance, when we scrubbed one of John's lounge, it was rather interesting. We had loaded the peroxide system, and the fellow on the ground support equipment says, yeah, I got the whole weight of the peroxide system in the spacecraft. But the guy that controls the gauges in the spacecraft says, I don't see anything in my spacecraft. You didn't pump it up. The guy says, yeah, but I mean, the scales tell me it has gone up there. Where is it? Now we had a horrible thought. It hadn't gone in the spacecraft. It had gone between the spacecraft and the heat shield. And it was sloshing around in there. There was a leak. Now peroxide, 92% peroxide, is looking for a hydrocarbon to go in what they call instant combustion. So now what do we do? Okay, you sit there, you think. Now, if you shake it well, it blows up. So we cleared all the pad first, and then what we decided is I got the engineer who knew the belly button, what you call the belly band and so on. Long story short, what we had to do is to take that spacecraft off the Atlas rocket, very carefully lift it over the side, get the fire department arranged around the pad. I said, now, when we come down 5 feet above the ground, we had a string, we drop the heat shield. You know, they had a heat shield would drop 4 feet. And you spray water like hell, you know, to dilute it. But we didn't know what would happen, so we very carefully demated it and then got it over on the side and dropped it down, and then we pulled the cord and they sprayed the water, nothing happened. But see, these are the things you learned. As a matter of fact, before we launched the ham. On the redstone pad, we had a 2-inch liftoff and it set back down. You know that famous thing. And then the parachute came out and all this jazz happened. So then, we were at the roadblock at that time, and I got a call from the blockhouse and it says, okay, we like to have, first thing was Dr. Davis was going to go ahead and have pad safety shoot holes in the rocket because the rockets wouldn't vent. You know, with all about the built-up pressure, the oxygen vent was closed, and he was going to shoot holes in it. Now Yardley objected to it because he said, I got a good spacecraft here. If you blow it up, I lose a good spacecraft. So then what do we do next? Now then they had a fellow ground supporter, a fellow by the name of Sharkey, and he was a mechanic. Now he had to go into the tail end of the Redstone rocket, sitting there pressurized, hook up a 1/4-inch GN2 line, and then open a hand valve, just that it would open but not too much because it would trigger the relief valve up there, and then run like hell back to the blockhouse, and just before he made the corner, you know, it relieved the pressure up there. A big old shot of oxygen, you know, gas came out. So now we had the thing, at least we had it depressurized. But now we found out that in the spacecraft itself there was what we call an O5G switch. That is a switch that when it detected the Earth's atmosphere at a certain pressure, it would fire the retro rockets. Now the retro rockets were sitting right above the alcohol tank on the Redstone. Now we couldn't have that happen though, but otherwise don't hit the spacecraft with anything. So Yardley asked, they were looking for some volunteers that were single, had no dependents, and would volunteer to go out, open the umbilical which had closed, and put 4 jumper cables in. Except to open the umbilical, you had to drill out some rivets to do that. Long story short, the spacecraft manager, Bob Graham, the tech supervisor, Jimmy Jones, and myself, we volunteered to go up there and do the work. Now what's interesting, by that time Pad Safety had come and put all kinds of cameras there. And I said, now what the hell good do these cameras do? They said, oh, we can't do anything for you, but at least we will see what happens when it happens. Real good thought.
So that was all to save the spacecraft?
All to save the spacecraft. So we went up there. They had brought the structure back in place. So we went up there and very carefully drilled out the rivets, and then very carefully inserted the pins. And then when the blocker said, okay, O5G is saved, you know, then we still had another problem with some switches, so we had to open the hatch. And it was funny, all the screws were matched to a particular hole. And I never forget the fellow that used to match these, you know, was very particular about it, where they would go. He had a cardboard box where he stuck all the screws in, and we just took the screws out and pitched them in the corner. And I said, oh, that guy is going to kill us when he finds out what we did to his screws. But anyhow, we opened the hatch and then cluck, cluck, 4 switches, and now we were safe. But this is how you used to do things.
That's amazing.